So a lot is going on, and I would like to start not with Ukraine, but with the Holy Land, Israel and Palestine. And as I was getting ready for this conversation today, I just look at the description. Why the Holy Land? Why? So Holy Land for the Christians is the birthplace of Jesus of Nazareth and the site of his ministry. For the Muslims, Jerusalem's Dome of the Rock that marks the spot from which the Prophet Muhammad is said to have ascended to heaven. I have three main things that I would like to address today in this conversation, and that is the land, the plan, and the timing. I really don't know much. Let's be honest, I don't know almost anything about this conflict that has been going on for generations, centuries, forever. It seems forever. However, if someone comes to you and doesn't know anything, like I don't, and will ask you, who has really created Hamas?
That's Scott's field. He's the best in that. So
I don't know about the best on it, but look, just to answer this question, I think it's important that people know where I'm coming from on this. I was a student of Russian history in college, but I was also a student of Middle Eastern history. I had a very, very fine professor, Professor Joseph, an Assyrian, Iraqi-born Assyrian Christian, who I took many courses from him, and then the Middle East was my bailiwick for some time now. I may have cut my arms control teeth in the Soviet Union, but I came to maturity as a real man, I guess, in the Middle East through war and through peace, through disarmament efforts, etc. I spent a lot of time in the Middle East. I almost lived there full time for about a decade. And much of that time was spent in Israel, working with Israelis, working with the Israeli Defense Force, working with the Israeli intelligence. And I was blessed while I was there to not only have access to the highest levels in Israel, but I was hosted by this fantastic Israeli intelligence officer who was extraordinarily open-minded. And, when I first went to Israel, they give you the standard, propaganda package tour, because the Israelis are some of the best in the world at selling Israel to the Goyim, to people like me, non-Jews. And so, they put you in the helicopter, which is always impressive, and then they fly you to Masada, and they show you Masada, they explain history. The whole idea is to create the idea of fortress Europe, fortress Israel, this Jewish enclave packed from all sides. They flew me to the Golan Heights. Well, actually, we didn't fly. We had to land and then drive up the Golan Heights, because it's much more dramatic to drive up the slopes of the Golan Heights while they explain how the Syrians were firing down and the Jewish soldiers had to fight their way up, and they're never going to fight their way up again. Once they've got it, they're never giving it back, and you're nodding your head going, oh, yeah, I got that. And then they take you to the Negev. I have toured many of the kibbutzes that have currently been at the front lines of this. There's an interesting museum in one that talks about the struggle of the kibbutzniks against the Gazans and that whole thing. But my guy was more than a propagandist. He was somebody, his whole approach was, Scott, kick a stone. And I'd kick a stone. He said, you've just uncovered centuries of history just by kicking that stone. Everything that has happened here is historic. I've walked the Via Dolorosa. I've walked the Stations of Christ in Jerusalem. I have gone to the Sea of Galilee and been to where Jesus performed. I went to the place where the miracle on the we turned water into wine and the fishes. I've been to the Jordan River where the baptism took place. And I'm not a devout Christian, but I have to tell you, that travel did something. It hits you, because you're like, wow, this is history. I've been to the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the Dome of the Rock. I've been inside. I've been given a tour by the Mufti. I've been to the Wailing Wall. And so I have touched the stone of all of the religions that are there. I'm not an expert in it, but I've been there. And I worked with Israeli intelligence. While I was in Israel, every single time I arrived, Hamas committed an act of terrorism. Sometimes the act of terrorism were just 100 yards away from where I was. Sometimes it was where I had eaten dinner the night before, or I'd gone shopping for my wife the day before. And it was personal. The Israelis I worked with would be crying, their eyes out because of the death. But I'd always say, hey, you guys want to take a break? And they'd say, no, we have to keep working. We have to keep working. And what were they working for? Because when I first went there, the prime minister at the time was Yitzhak Rabin. He's the man who did the 1993 Oslo Accords. He's the man who did Oslo II in September of 1995. He was a man of peace. And the people I worked with believed in him and believed in that mission. The guys I talked to, the vast majority of them were Sabras. They had been born there. They were Israelis through and true. Their parents had been the Zionists who came over in the 20s who built the kibbutz. But they understood that they had to learn to live in peace with the Palestinians if there was ever going to be peace there. And that's what Yitzhak Rabin stood for, and that's what the officer who hosted me stood for. There was a guy named the engineer, Ayash, his name was, a Hamas operative who built the bombs, all the bombs that went off. And the Israelis finally got him in an operation, a cell phone with 15 grams of high explosive. He answered the phone. They confirmed it was him. Pop, boom, dead. And I would talk. I said, that's I guess that's a good thing they got. And they said, yeah, but you do understand, Scott, that we made him. We made him. We're responsible for Hamas. It's something that's sprung up from the tragedy of the Palestinian people. When I was in the Negev at the kibbutzes, we were talking about how this happened. In 1946, there was only 500 Jews in the Negev desert. 500. In October of 1946, they carried out what's called the 11 Points Operation, where teams of Israeli soldiers would seize a hilltop, take control of it, and then they brought in prefabricated buildings to create this kibbutz. And they'd be right next to these Arab villages. In many of these places, overnight, this Israeli settlement shows up and they bring in people and they're just quadrupling, tripling, order of magnitude, increasing the Jewish population in the Negev. But they were next to these Arab villages. And the Arab villages on this one hillside, the Israelis that took it over didn't have any water. So they're there on top of the hill. They got no water. The Arabs brought water to them and said, here's water. Welcome our neighbors. Some of us aren't happy about this, but we recognize the inevitability of this. We welcome you. And then as 1946 turned into 1948, it became inevitable that Israel was going to take the Negev. And so these Arabs all went to their Israeli neighbors and said, hey, we're living in peace. So when this happens, please let us stay here in our homes. And the Israelis are all like, yep. Boom, the war came and they wiped them all out. They went into the villages of the villagers who gave them water and they killed the men into a ravine and shot them. They went house by house by house, shooting the men in there. But this sounds a lot like what happened on Saturday. It is exactly what happened on Saturday. But this time it's Israelis kicking down the door, shooting the men, evicting hundreds of thousands of these people, what they call the Nakba, the catastrophe. They put the women and children and the surviving men on trucks and shipped them to Gaza. And then around Gaza, they built a series of kibbutzes to hold them in, keep them prisoner there. So they created this open-air concentration camp. And the kibbutzes are there to keep the Arabs in. That's it. That's what happened. Now, they had a problem here. One of if you study Israeli history, and I have, like I said, I lived there. I worked with them, and my host was a historically minded. There's a speech. In America, we have the Gettysburg Address, Abraham Lincoln's great address given in Gettysburg after the battle, and it's seen as one of the great statements of who we are as a people. We, the government of the people, by the people, for the people, great speech. Well, the Israelis have a similar speech, but it's the eulogy read by Moshe Dayan in 1956 for a guy named Roy Rutenberg. Roy Rutenberg was a soldier of the kibbutz. He was in one of the kibbutzes now that's at the front line of this, where some horrible things happened on Saturday and Sunday. But he was ambushed by by Arabs from Gaza and killed. Um, and there's a lot of anger. And so Moshe Dayan came and gave a speech. And in the speech, he says, don't blame the Gazans. He says, because we live here on the land we stole from their families. We live on this land and they stare at us with eyes of hatred and we ignore them. We pretend they don't exist. We treat them as animals. So don't blame them for coming at us, because this is what we did. Then he goes on to say, but what we did, we had to do. We had to do. And we must keep the sword in our hand to keep these people away. That's the reality. Israel created the problem of Gaza, created the problem of the Palestinian of the West Bank. Then what happens in the 1980s, when Yasser Arafat's Fatah movement, PLO, become very powerful and influential, the Israelis say, how do we break them up? Within Gaza, because it's very close to Egypt, and Egypt had a movement, the Muslim Brotherhood, very radical, violent-oriented group, and the Egyptians suppressed them, killed a lot of guys, arrested a lot of guys. The number two man, Zawahiri in Al-Qaeda, was a Muslim Brotherhood dude from Egypt. But many of the Muslim Brotherhood gravitated to Gaza, where they were hiding out from the Egyptians. What the Israelis did is said, hey, why don't we empower the Muslim Brotherhood? Why don't we help turn them into a movement that can offset Yasser Arafat's PLO? So in the 1980s, Israel made Hamas. Israel made Hamas. Now, you already had the elements there, but Israel breathed life into them. Israel created Hamas. In 2006, Israel helped Hamas move from being a terrorist organization. And just think what I'm saying. Israel made the organization that was blowing up buses when I was in Israel. Israel made the organization that blew up a restaurant that I used to eat at when I was in Israel. Israel made this organization, and now they're at war with this organization. And then in 2006, they do something even more unbelievable. They helped turn Hamas into a political movement, not just a terrorist movement, but to mainstream them, to legitimize them, to make them a movement capable of governing Gaza, because the purpose was to strip Gaza away from the West Bank, from Fatah, from the PLO. And they succeeded. And now we ask what happened this most recent go-around. Israel's been struggling to deal with Hamas ever since. And the current feeling is that they have succeeded in creating the conditions where Hamas will stop being a terrorist organization whose charter, by the way, used to read, the destruction of Israel was their mission. They've modified it with words, and some people say, see, they're not calling for the destruction of Israel. They really are. They just changed the word. That happened in 2006, so the settlements could be withdrawn. In 2005, become a purely Palestinian land, but it's a concentration camp run by the Israelis. Everything's run by the Israelis. But they make Hamas. Now, what they said this time around was, because everybody's calling this an intelligence failure. This is the biggest intelligence failure ever. Well, it is, but it's also a byproduct of something that's been biting the Israelis in the butt for decades, called the conception. See, Israelis tend to believe they know best about everything dealing with Israel. I'm here to tell you right now, one of the reasons why it's so screwed up is they don't, because they're corrupted by their arrogance, their hubris. They're blinded to reality because they bought into this Zionist fantasy of this is God's mission to give this to us, therefore we ignore everything else. But they came in and they said, we know we're getting signals from Hamas, from intelligence, that there's something going on. But we believe that the Hamas leadership has made the transition from terrorist group to a governing body. And we've facilitated that by, and here's again the arrogance of this. We opened the doors recently and allowed 1,000 Gazans to go into Israel and get menial jobs, to do the scut work that nobody else wants to do, minimum wage jobs. Now, we search them, strip searches on the way in, and we strip search, so we dehumanize them both ways, but we give them a couple shekels. And then they come in and they say, oh, look, we have shekels. We're able to buy a little bit of stuff. And the Israelis went, see, we've made life better for them. They would never do anything to undo that. But they did, because Hamas has been playing Israel. Hamas, we go back to Moshe Dayan's words, Hamas has been sitting in Gaza staring at the Israelis on the other side of the line with burning fire in their eyes. They hate these people who stole their land because it was their land. They hate these people who murdered their grandparents because those grandparents were the original settlers on that. Hamas will never forgive Israel, never forgive the Israelis, and the cycle of hatred will continue. But to answer your question, who created Hamas? Israel created Hamas. If you sow the wind, you reap the whirlwind. And that's what is happening to Israel